Hi, in this video you're going to learn how to build a user authentication layer for your single-page application using Laravel and VueJs. Before we start, I created two separate applications, VueJs single-page application on a front end and the Laravel application on a back end. They're both running locally on my laptop. So let's go to the front end of our application. If we go to browser, we can see that we have a login component with a simple form, and we have a post page which calls a backend API and retrieves the data. So if you go to the post component, source views post index, we can see that we import a repository module at the top, and when this component is mounted, we call the getPost method, get a response, and update our post object. If you look at the getPost method, it's a simple get call to our backend. And you can see at the top, we import an API module, which is basically an access wrapper. So if you go back to our post page, we can see it's accessible by anyone. So let's put it under authentication layer so only logged in users can access it. So let's jump to the backend. Let's go to the routes, and as we can see, we only have one route. It's get to the post, and if you go to a post controller, we can see it basically returns an array of values. Now we can start building the login logic. Let's create a login route and a controller. Here you can see a simple login method. Here you can see we created a basic login method, and we provided the email and password, and we use the auth facade. And basically what the attempt method does is, behind the scenes, it will go to the users table and search for their user with provided email. And if the user is found, the hashed password stored in the database will be compared with the password value passed to the credentials array. So this one. Also, we don't need to hash this password here because the attempt method will do that for us. And if two passwords, hashed passwords match, an authenticated session will be started for the user. So, and if the credentials are invalid, we just abort, which basically throws an exception. While we're at it, we can create a logout action as well. So again, we use logout method for the auth facade, and this will clear the authentication information in the user session. We should also create an endpoint for the logout action. And we should import the login controller here in our routes. Now we can install the Laravel Sanctum package. This package offers a simple way to authenticate users using Laravel's built-in cookie-based session authentication services. So I'm just going to follow the official documentation and first of all install the package using Composer. Now we should also publish the configuration files using this command. And let's add Sanctum's middleware to the API middleware group. So if we go to http:/kernel, we should add this value right here. For now, I will skip this step because it's not necessary. If we go back to our routes, now we can add a Sanctum guard to the post route. So this guard will ensure that incoming requests are authenticated. So middle Now we need to change session and course configuration settings so it allows requests from our Vue.js single-page application. Let's go to the config/sanctum. And if you don't see this file, make sure to run the publish command because it creates the configuration file. So inside the config, we need to provide Sanctum stateful domains so that requests coming from provided domains can receive authentication cookies. We do this in our environment file. So if you go to .v, we have to change the So as you can see, you can pass multiple domains using the comma symbol, and you should also provide a port. So my front-end is running on the 8081, so I provided it right here. Oh, I say I made a typo, localhost. Yes, and for production, you should pass a valid domain. Now we should go to the session configuration, so session.php. In our case, we are using the session driver file. As you can see here, we should also set a session domain. So if you go to session domain, let's set this value to localhost. So because our front-end application is running on localhost, I've set the session domain variable to localhost in my environment file. Let's go back to the session configuration and let's find a secure variable. We also have to change the secure option because our front-end application is not running on the HTTPS connection. So let's set the session secure cookie to false in our dev environment. We're almost finished with our configuration. Let's go to the course.php config and make sure to change the supports credentials to true and set the path to API/star and sanctum./csrf cookie. So the backend is ready. Now we have to configure the front end. If we go to the post view, and we can see that it no longer fetches the posts and gets an error, this means that our backend is protected and working properly. So let's create a login logic in our login component. So let's open the login component. Here you can see that we have two inputs binded to a user model. We have a few paragraphs which indicate loading state or show errors. We also have a login button, which when clicked will call this login method, which is currently empty. So let's start writing our login method. So here we are using the vuex for our Vue.js application, and we are calling the login action inside our vuex store, and we are passing the user model. Of course, the login action does not exist yet, so let's create it. So let's go to the store index.js, and at the top we have to import the repository module, which will contain all the backend routes. So let's import it. So if you go to this module, we can see that it at the moment has only one route, get post. So let's add the login endpoints. So notice we have created a create session endpoint, and it is automatically provided by Laravel Sanctum package, and this will be later needed for the login endpoint. So at the top, you can see the API module, which is a global Axios wrapper, and we need to change some settings here. So first of all, let's make sure that Axios with credentials or settings is set to true. This is needed for our course configuration. We should also configure the interceptors for each request and response. So let's start with the request interceptors first. So instance So these request interceptors will be ran before each call to the backend. And here we set two headers, accept and content type to application JSON. So now let's create a response interceptor. So we also created a response interceptor that will come in handy later. Now let's return back to the store module and create an authentication module. So if we go to the store index.js, let's create an authentication module. So first we define a state. Okay, so we will store our authenticated user inside the state, and other components will access the user data using the getters defined here. So we also define the getter authenticated, which will tell if there is a user in the state. We also created a mutation setUser to update the user value in state. Finally, we created a login action, which will call the backend and log the user in. Inside our login action, you can see that we first have to call the create session endpoint and only then call the login endpoint. That's because during the request, Laravel will set the XSRF token cookie containing the current CSRF token. So the token will be automatically passed inside Axios headers on subsequent requests. So once the CSRF protection is initialized, we will call the login endpoint. And on successful login request, the user will be authenticated and subsequent requests will be automatically authenticated using the session cookie that Laravel issued to the client. So let's create a user record in the database and let's test the login component. I will use the PHP artisan tinker for it and run the factory command. So we can see a new user record inside our database. So now that we have created a user, we should test the login endpoint. If everything is working correctly after a successful request to the login endpoint, we should be redirected to the post page. So let's test it. Success. We can also see the authenticated getter set to true inside the Vue DevTools. So if we load the state, we can see that authenticated is set to true, and we have a user object right here. And there are still a few problems. Even though we are logged in, we can still go to the login page. And if you deleted the cookies, so let's delete the cookies, we can still access the post page, which is bad. We want to protect this page, and if user is not logged in, to not allow him to reach this page. So let's create a middleware which protects unauthenticated users from reaching this page. So let's create a new folder inside router and call it middleware. It should also contain a new folder called rules, and let's create a few rules. The first one is user.js. So created a user role, which basically checks the star getters, and if the authenticated getter returns true, it means that we have an authenticated user in the state, so meaning the request can pass through. And if the authenticated is false, we just redirect the user to the login page. So now let's create a guest role. Here we inverse the user role. If user is authenticated, we redirect him to the post page, else we pass the request through. Now let's create a global middleware, call it index.js, which will import both of these rules. And now we can apply this middleware to our routes. So if we go to routes.js, let's import the middleware. And let's apply the middleware to our routes. Let's go back to the browser. If you try clicking on the links, nothing happens because we are unauthenticated. So let's try to log in and see if we can access the post page. So now we are in the post page and we can't access the login page, which is good. We can now update our navigation so logged in users don't see the login link and the guests do not see the post. So inside the app.vue, let's import the map getters from the vuex. And this way we can access the authenticated property from the global auth state. Let's use this computed property inside our template and hide the buttons. So the login should be hidden if authenticated is false, and if the user is logged in, you should see the post. Yeah, so now we can't see the irrelevant links. But if you try to refresh a page, as you can see, we are still redirected to the login page. So the user inside our vuex store is getting delete on refresh. We can solve this problem by putting the user object inside the session storage. And this way we won't lose our user data on the refresh. So let's go to the store and login action. Store and login action. And after successful login, let's add the user data to the storage. We can also update the default user value in the state to first check if there is a user in the session storage. So let's do that. And now let's try to log in. So as you can see, we have an user object in our state. And if you refresh a page, the user won't be deleted and the vuex will access the user from the state. And so as you can see, we still have the user. However, using this approach, we may run into the problem when the session expires on the backend, but the user exists in the session storage on the frontend. So we have to fix this. And so let's do that by going to the Axios settings, and we will use the response interceptors. So basically what we'll do is we will check the error status we get from the backend, and if the status is 401, meaning that we have an unauthenticated, unauthorized request, we will delete the user from the session storage. So let's do that. We will also call a window.location.reload. So if we receive the 401 status, we delete the user from the session storage, and we also reload the page. And this will trigger the route middleware, which will not find the user in the state and will redirect to the login page. So it basically will trigger this middleware. So the authentication layer is almost complete. We only need to create the logout button. So let's add it. And let's create the logout method. So the way this will work is we will dispatch the logout action to our auth module, which don't exist yet, so we need to create it. Sync logout. We should call the logout endpoint in the backend. And set the user inside the state to null, and we also can delete the user from the session storage. So now we can test it. As you can see, the request returned status code 200, and we can check inside the session storage, there is no user. So that's pretty much it. I hope you find this video helpful, and see you on the next one.